Hello, I'm Mark, and this is the Fast Track Impact podcast for researchers who want to be more productive and achieve real-world impacts from their research. Hello everyone, it is fantastic to be back, and this is now the third season of the podcast, 3 years running. And this season, I think, might be longer than the others. I figured that I would wait until I had enough useful things to say, rather than just running an endless podcast and running out of good material. But I have to confess I've left this a little bit longer than I intended. Things got a bit busy, and this kind of fell by the wayside. And I've been collecting ideas now over the last year, and yeah, they're kind of spilling over into lots and lots of episodes. So I've got at least 24 episodes kind of outlined. But I'm just going to go with the flow and record these week on week, and I'm kind of guessing that there may be even more material than that will emerge over the next few weeks and months. So who knows? We could be in for a long haul here, and the key thing is this is about making sure that this is really useful stuff. So I'm going to be talking about two things primarily in this season. As with the last season, I want to make sure that we still do some stuff on productivity, but this is going to be my kind of deep take on productivity, which is about being happier with what you produce and being more efficient so that you can actually get more time off, and as a result of getting some better work-life balance, enjoying your work more and actually being much more productive in a deeper sense than you might be at the moment. So we'll be diving into that. And that's based on my recent book, The Productive Researcher. As with my last two books, I've been taking it out on the road and training across lots of very different universities, and I'll be drawing on my experience working one-to-one with people that I'm mentoring around this book, and one-to-many in the workshops that I'm running. Lots of difficult, challenging questions that are helping me to move forward in my thinking, and I'll be sharing those insights with you. The second area that we're, of course, going to be focusing on is research impact. And as you are probably aware, I have recently launched the second edition of the Research Impact Handbook, and available on Amazon, of course, unless you're listening in Australia, where we're unable to sell for some complicated tax-based reasons, in which case you can email my PA, Maddie, on pa@fasttrackimpact.com. So I'm going to be sharing with you some of my latest insights on research impact. Some of this will be from the second edition. But again, based on what I'm learning as I'm taking the second edition out on the road and training researchers live with this book and getting responses, getting questions, having to adapt. And so the latest insights that I'm getting from this will be to you. I'm also going to be telling you about some of the latest research. I'm writing a number of papers on research impact at the moment. Doing original research on this, some of these focusing on motivations, unintended consequences, some of this around evidencing impact, lots of other things. And as I record this season, I will be writing these and learning with my co-authors and sharing those insights as we go as well. The second season was recorded kind of 50-50 interviews out on the road and in the studio. And I decided this time that actually the whole thing of going into the studio to record the podcast, it was a bit of a logistical challenge given the way that my life is set up. And so my producer, Dan Lyth, has set me up with a professional studio in my office. So I'm hoping this is going to sound almost as good as it sounded in the studio. And Dan Lyth will be producing each of these episodes before it goes out to make sure it still sounds very nice. So thanks, Dan. Today's podcast episode is going to start with the basics. Now, right at the beginning of the first season, I discussed with you what I perceived to be impact at that point. And in the intervening 2 years, my understandings of what impact really is have developed. They've become more nuanced, more... I guess I'm understanding the issues around impact much more deeply now. But at the same time, I've been getting more and more crystal clear about what this is in its simplest terms. And I want to share with you a couple of definitions that I've developed, which I've published in the second edition of my handbook, and a typology, 10 different types of impact that, in theory, are out there that you can look for, that you can pursue, that you can evaluate. And for me, this is really powerful stuff. It's really important because, first of all, I believe that if we are clear in our thinking about what impact is, then we can be clear in the plans that we make and the work that we do. And that means we can be efficient as well and not waste time. But then when I look at the typology, I think this is also really important because I think we can often get quite blinkered and we're focusing so much on that one type of impact that we're pursuing that we forget that actually there may be other benefits that we're not aware of, or other unintended negative consequences. And we need to take a much fuller, broader, holistic approach to this if we want to really understand the full breadth, depth, reach of the benefits that might arise from our research. So let's start with definitions. And I'm going to give you my simplest and most powerful definition for what research impact is. And it's a single word. Now, for me, I actually do feel quite embarrassed about this because it's taken me, 2 years. It was about 2 years since I published the first edition of the book, and I've been training with this. I've trained over 4,000 researchers, 55 different countries. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and it's taken me all of this time to come up with such a simple definition. I actually managed to stop the second edition going to press, and I held it back and I said, look, guys, I need to just integrate this one sentence into the book because this is so important. And it has been that recent that I've got this level of clarity. And it came through training based on the book. So I was already training based on the second edition, although it wasn't actually out yet. And I was training increasingly. I started using this word, and whenever I used this word, I would see these light bulb moments going on in people's heads and displayed by their faces where, okay, so actually it's as simple as that. And I think that as academics, we're good at making things complicated, aren't we, guys? and we've kind of done this with impact. And so there's mass confusion out there. What actually is this thing called impact? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it this? Is it that? And actually, it is really simple. My one-word definition of impact is simply benefit. And even more powerful than that, if I actually turn that word into a question, who benefits, then this for me begins to unlock a whole load of stuff. So just do a find and replace in your mind and find the word impact and now just replace it with the word benefit. And what I'm finding when I'm working with researchers with this word is that it's like the scales fall off their eyes and they look at their research and their pathway to impact, all the engagement work that they're doing, and instantly you can see whether or not it is yet an impact. So all of that engagement work that I've been doing, all of the media, the publicity, the social media, strategy, all this stuff, I'm looking at it now and I'm asking myself the question, has anyone benefited yet? And if the answer is, well, I'm not sure, it doesn't look like it, then what you've got is engagement, which is great. That's your pathway. That's the first step, but it is only engagement. And as soon as you have any evidence that that engagement has benefited someone, whether that is that they understand something, they're aware of something, you've transformed their thinking, or this is something more instrumental, you save someone's life. If they have benefited, that is the point at which your engagement has turned from engagement into impact. So impact is simply benefit. And for me, the reason why turning this into the question, who benefits, is so important is that this begins to make us aware that, of course, these are people who are benefiting ultimately, whether indirectly or directly, and ultimately there may be winners and losers, and there may be one person who benefits at the expense of another, one group that benefit at the expense of another. And this leads me to my next definition. So benefit is my one word, really crystal clear, simple definition. But to extend on this, the other definition that I've put into the second edition of my handbook is the good that researchers do in the world. And for me, this definition has a number of important components. And it might sound simple, and I have been accused by some of my co-authors of various papers in which I've been writing this of not just being clear and simple, but potentially being simplistic. And I think that the word that my colleagues are objecting to is this word good. And I think they're objecting for good reasons, because actually that word good is deeply problematic. And that is actually why I've used it in my definition, because this is the good that researchers do in the world. And that means that this is very clearly now a value judgment. What is good to me, in my perception, or to one group in one place, in one culture at one time, may be bad in the perception of another group, in another place, culture and time. So there is this idea of winners and losers. There is the idea that actually this is potentially in the eye of the beholder. And it really now matters who is looking, who is evaluating this, as to whether or not this is likely to be perceived as good, and whether others will agree with me that this is a good thing that I did in my research. The next part of this definition is the good that researchers do in the world. And there is, of course, agency here. This is not something that just happens. You don't just do research. It doesn't just grow legs and go out and make a difference. We as researchers have to take the data and information that we produce in our papers, our books, our performances, whatever the output is, and turn that data and information into knowledge in someone's head before a person can either use that knowledge or benefit from it in some way. And so it is us, it is the researchers who are generating that data and information who need to not only make our work accessible, but make it understandable as well. And so for me, this is essentially a learning process. And that is what we're good at. We know about learning and teaching. We know about how students learn. And we need to start thinking about how we apply what we know about how people learn to how we enable others to both access and understand our research so they can use and benefit from it. So we are at the center of this definition. It's not going to happen without us. But then finally, there is a venue for this impact. This is, of course, the good that researchers do in the world. And I think it's important for us to recognize that this is not about what we can do for our own careers, for our own esteem, or even for our PhD students and our postdocs and the wider academic community, or even for our students. This is about what we can do beyond the academy to make the world a better place, whether this is a spin-out company, whether this is saving someone's life, whether this is a cultural impact or an understanding or an awareness impact. This is something that is beyond the academy. Now, in the UK, we have this thing called the Research Excellence Framework, or REF, and it does muddy the waters somewhat by including pedagogical impacts. That's one of the things that count. But I would argue, even if we look at pedagogical impacts through the eyes of this definition, what we're trying to do, especially in more applied disciplines, is to think about how we can design our learning and teaching effectively as interventions that are designed to enable our students to take what they've learned in the classroom out into their workplace so they can use what they've learned to affect change for their organizations or the people that their organizations serve. And so you can actually think about designing your teaching in very specific ways. You can think about how you might incentivize your students to stay in touch with you so you can get in touch with them a year or 2 years down the line to find out, did what you learned actually translate into benefits for anyone in the workplace if you went into the relevant line of work that we were hoping you would go into. And all of a sudden, you've got a very clear argument that, yes, this isn't just about transforming how we do learning and teaching in this discipline, which can, in theory, count in our ref. But we did that, and as a result, people are equipped now to go into the workplace to do things in a new way. This takes me now to the typology. And pedagogical impacts are an additional type, which isn't one of my 10. And I'm going to just go through these in turn and think with you about how strategic these might be in terms of things you might want to prioritize in different contexts. So, for example, pre-award, things that might get you funding so that you can actually get the money to do the research that will make that difference. And also then post-award, what are the things that funders in particular seem to like or research assessors seem to like. So I've got my book in front of me. I'm just turning to the relevant page. You'd think I'd have memorized this now, but not quite. It's still fairly fresh. And I'm going to start with a series of types of impact that can be stepping stones. And so there are impacts that can lead to other impacts, and you can get a chain of impacts where one thing leads to another. And at all of the points in that chain of three things, you have impact. And I think that it's important to think about this in this way because a lot of us, I think, focused so much on the end game that we forget that actually many of the steps along the way are not just engagement. These are also impacts that we may want to evaluate. And if they've worked, we may want to report on as well. So, for example, I may start by doing some public engagement, or maybe I'm going to have a social media strategy, and I'm going to try and make people aware of something. I'm going to change understanding. And as a result of all of this engagement, what I'm looking for now is evidence that not only did people tune into that radio program, not only are people watching that YouTube video, but actually, as a result of that engagement, did anyone learn anything? Is there now a growing awareness in a particular group of people about something linked to my research? And if so, at that point, that engagement has already turned into impact. I'm going to want to then look at, well, is this significant? And for what reasons might this be important that people now understand this, where they were previously unaware? And what is the reach of that? Is this just me and my family and a few people in my hometown? Or actually now through these much broader engagement mechanisms, have I actually made a whole community of practice, a whole nation aware of something that they were not previously aware of? Now you can see how this then might, and this is a might, transform someone's attitudes. Now, we know that there is not a link perfectly between these two. You can learn something, you can understand something new, and you can still keep some fairly horrific attitudes if you want to. But it is credible that through that engagement, once people have become aware of something, that they may actually change their attitudes. And you may actually design things in a way which is designed to confront people with their attitudes and get people to think more deeply about them and potentially shift an attitude that may be in some way detrimental, to, for example, to another group. And I would argue that even if it stops there, this is an impact. and it's an impact in and of itself. So, for example, if I have now changed attitudes towards racism in football, for example, the fact that I have changed attitudes at some kind of scale across an entire football league, whether or not that has actually translated into some kind of action on the ground, and there are now different players on the pitch or whatever it is, the fact that I've changed attitudes counts. That matters. And you can articulate an argument that shows that this is a significant change. It's different and it's important. And you can look at the reach of this. How many new people now think differently as a result of your intervention? And an even bigger might is that attitudinal change might eventually then transform into changes in behaviour, different decisions. And as a result, then you get a whole series of other more instrumental benefits. Now, traditionally, we might see that process of raising awareness, changing attitudes as the kind of the preparing grounds for that ultimate instrumental change, and then only talk to our funders or to others who might be evaluating our impact about that final end of pipe solution that, yeah, it worked, and now as a result, people are safer or whatever it is. And I think it's important to try and recognise that here are some impacts that I can actually look at. I can evaluate their significance and their reach. I can collect evidence, and now I can force my funders and other evaluators to look at these and ask themselves, is this not an impact that I would care about? And you're more likely to get that credit if you actually articulate that and evidence that process. Now, there's one other type of impact that I want to talk about as a stepping stone type impact before I look at some of these more instrumental types of impact. And that is capacity building impact or preparedness impact. And as a type of impact, this is of huge importance. So we can go and create the capacity to do something new. There are new skills, there is new equipment, there is a new methodology. People are connected to one another who were not previously connected to one another. And as a result of that capacity, people then can ultimately do new things that they were not able to do before. They can adapt to change. They are more likely to be resilient when something bad happens to them. And of course, that really counts. But again, you need to think about evidencing the fact that you are building capacity and think about how can I actually build the capacity that is needed? What are the needs of this organisation, this group, and how can I meet them? But then you can ask the question, well, what happened as a result? I built the capacity, and how did people use it? And at this point, I want to just flag the strategic issue here, which is that I think we often overlook these kinds of impacts because we're so focused on the ultimate win. Did we save lives? Did we make lives better, for example? That we overlook these important stepping stones. And for capacity building, I think it's particularly important not to overlook because for many types of research funding, this is something that is very attractive. A lot of research funders want to build capacity. And of course, yes, they want to then know if that capacity was used and how it might be used in future. But in particular, if you're working in particular areas, for example, international development, this is something that you will need to think about how you will, on purpose, go about building capacity. And that can be very strategic and can help fund the work that you want to do. In the terms of research assessment, if you've got an evaluator looking at your impact, I think that capacity building impacts are much less attractive. So I think the question will always be asked, well, great, in theory, sounds good, but what happened next? Did anyone use this? Did this make a difference or not? And if not, well, great in theory, but I'm not quite as impressed as if there was evidence that something worked. And of course, that's very difficult because very often these are things that are highly uncertain or far in the future. I met a researcher a couple of years ago now who was doing stuff on earthquakes and earthquake preparedness, and he'd managed to change planning regulations and the way that buildings were made in an entire city. And he came to me and he said, yeah, so I would like to submit this as evidence of the fact that my research has impact. But there's just one flaw. I just need there to be an earthquake. I don't want there to be an earthquake, really, honestly. But actually, there's a bit of me that thinks it would be quite handy, because then that's the only proof I will ever have that the stuff I've done actually works and actually saves lives. So the same thing applies to understanding and awareness impacts and attitudinal changes. I think that both pre-award when you're applying for funding and post-award when you're trying to talk to your funders, it is worth explicitly mentioning this and saying, look, here is an actual impact, and let's now broaden our impact objectives and clearly articulate this as something specifically that I want to achieve. But typically this is something that is not valued as much as those instrumental impacts that ultimately come as a result of that behaviour change or that decision that is then made as a result of that new information, knowledge, change in attitudes or whatever. So let's make sure we capture that stuff, and that can give us some really important early wins and some really valuable formative feedback that will suggest whether or not we're on track to achieving those other solutions. But finally, then, the rest of the types of impact, these more instrumental impacts. I'll put a link to the online version of this chapter from my book in the show notes, so you can look at the detailed definitions of this for yourself. And in each of these, I've given you a definition, and I've given you some examples of the kinds of impact that you might see and how you might go about evidencing those kinds of impact. But we've got environmental impacts, we've got health and well-being impacts. We've got policy impact, which, of course, then may have, as a result of the policy being implemented, the health and well-being benefits or environmental benefits as well. So policy impacts as an impact based on the fact that there is now a new policy, which is based on this new evidence from your research, as another potential stepping stone to other benefits that come once that policy is implemented and works. We've got other forms of decision-making and behaviour impacts. Some of these are direct, some of them are indirect. Some of this is about group or organisational behaviours. It could be an individual or household type behaviour change. There's a broad range of different things now that might come out of some kind of attitude changing or awareness building type campaign. Then we've got cultural impacts. So this would be changes in prevailing values, attitudes, beliefs, discourse, patterns of behaviour. Some of this is explicit, so culture that is codified in rules or law. Some of it is implicit, so rules of thumb, accepted practices. And this could be an organisational culture, it could be at the level of a social group or a society. But the point is that as a result of that cultural change, people benefit, and you can articulate why the world is better, why that organisation is better, why these people are benefiting as a result of that change. Then there's a range of other social benefits which are not covered by these other types. So, for example, access to education or improvements in human rights. And yeah, that's it, 10, I believe, counting these up now. Yeah, we have 10 different types of impact that you can, in theory, generate from your research. And to conclude, I want to just give you a little key to using this. So, yeah, great in theory, Mark. You've given me 10 different types of impact that I could try and achieve through my research. How does that benefit me? For me, the way that I like to use this is effectively as a checklist. And I can use this both pre-award and post-award. So as I'm scratching my head and trying to come up with a series of impact goals as part of an impact summary in a grant award, I might start by saying, well, I do environmental research, so that's what it's all about. Or we're going to be coming up with some new innovation which will lead to a spin-out company, and it's all about the economic benefit. And you can get quite narrow in your thinking and actually miss the opportunity to write something far more persuasive and competitive if you don't look beyond your current focus. And so for me, this is a checklist that I go through to say, right, well, my primary motivation here is I want to save this habitat or species. But actually, are there some social benefits that might go alongside this? Are there policy changes that will be necessary to make this happen? And can I articulate that as an initial impact goal? And now I've got something much richer, much fuller, much more competitive pre-award. The other way of looking at this is then post-award and saying, right, I've done something, I've got some impact, and someone is now asking me to report on this. Maybe it's my funder, maybe this is a research assessment exercise like the REF in the UK, or the Engagement and Impact Framework in Australia, or this proliferation of things that are going on around the world. And of course, I can report on the key thing that I care most deeply about. We saved the habitat. We saved that species. Amazing. We made millions of pounds, or whatever it was that you were trying to achieve. But again, going through this typology as a checklist and asking yourself, what about those other things? Are there some additional benefits here that we have achieved? And actually now you discover very often that there is a richer, deeper, and more resonant story that you can tell. So my spin-out company that made someone millions of pounds actually was so successful perhaps because the manufacturing process was so much more efficient, and we reduced the cost of this product to consumers, and as a result dominated the market. But actually the reason it was so efficient was because we made the manufacturing process less carbon intensive, and we saved greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a climate benefit. And hey, the people who use this, actually, this is a new product, and this is enhancing people's lives. It's enabling them to do things they weren't able to do before. And I'm going to interview some of these people and find the richness of how they have benefited in ways that I wasn't expecting. And that brings me to my final point, which is that I believe that if we have a clear-sighted understanding of what impact is, this idea that it is a benefit, this is the good that researchers do in the world, and we have now a holistic conception of all the different types of impact that might theoretically be possible from our work, we're able to look in a much more clear-sighted way at whether there might be some disadvantages for certain groups or negative unintended consequences. And actually, is this an economic benefit at the expense of the environment, for example? Am I benefiting this group at the expense of another group? And now, when we move from these really competitive impact goals now into a structured impact planning process, we can start to think about whether we can work with those other groups to try and ameliorate some of the worst negative impacts of what we're doing, or potentially abandon the whole idea because we've discovered, when we think much clearer and more holistically about this, that actually this is a really mixed blessing and maybe not something that I'm willing to put my neck on the line for, because I can now see the many different ways this might go. So what is impact? I hope I've enabled you to understand this now to a level that is much clearer than you've ever understood it before. And it is on that foundation that I'm going to be building a number of episodes over the rest of this season to explore much more deeply the rights, the wrongs, the morals, the ethics, the politics, but also the practicalities and the tips, the guidance, the strategies, the things that will make you confident, that will enable you to achieve impact without having to work any more weekends or evenings than you already do.